Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly oh, say. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rugged the bombs bursting in air gave proof through
this little light of mine, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Oh,
oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. And the rugged the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that and the hum of the rain.
I can breathe. Breathe the name of it. I can breathe shit.
Okay, folks, let's try that. See if that helps. I basically have shut down everything except for the computer itself. It said something was competing for my microphone. I didn't see anything obvious, so I shall keep an eye on that. So good morning to all of you, Lisa, Paul, Juanita, Ervelyn, Nikisha says, I love your program. You bring the news right by our doorsteps and we don't have to go out for it. Thank you so much, Nikisha. I appreciate that. Karen, thank you for tuning in. Stephanie is here. Gina, Grace, Dimitrik, Wiz Bites, Odette, and of course, Keisha. Good morning, Mama. How's the family? Well, everyone is good. Um, 3-year-old going a little bit stir crazy, to be honest. Actually, the night before, I got a funny story to tell you guys. The night before, she seems to get stir crazy like really late at night when she should be sleeping. And my husband decided, because we're trying to explain to her some of what's going on. Obviously, a 3-year-old has a very limited understanding of what this is all about, right? So he decided to call the police station and explain to her, we can't go out because the police said we can't do so. And these are the rules, and we have to follow the rules in life, right? Well, that's what we tell each other anyway. I'm going to talk about some of that here this morning. By the way, I have 2 guests that are scheduled to come on, but unfortunately, I've already had one cancellation. Charles Whittaker has a bit of an emergency situation that he needs to deal with, and unfortunately, that means he is unlikely to be joining us this morning. I'm still waiting on Frank McField. He should be joining us at 8:15. I've not heard any cancellations from him, so we'll just play it by ear and see how that goes. So my husband called the police station, explained to the officer, thank God it was a woman, she's probably a bit more sensitive, but she had a bit of a chuckle about, the fact that her daughter had her suitcase that she's been walking around the house with for like the past, I don't even know how many months now. And she basically wants to go somewhere. She has some fictional character in her head called Mr. Browning, and she wants to go to his house. But in order to get to his house, apparently you have to get on a plane. So my husband kind of gave this lady the short version of that story. And the officer, he said, can you explain to her why we can't do that? And so the officer was very nice and friendly and attempted to assist with the situation by saying, young lady, you can't go anywhere right now. And of course, sometimes a 3-year-old needs to hear it from somebody other than their parents, because we say it every single day. It's like, Mom, Dad, no, this isn't what's really going on. So the officer explained to her that unfortunately right now it's, the police don't want you going anywhere. You can't go out of your house. You can't travel. And so she was kind of a little bit more accepting of that. She's like, okay. And then the police officer's like, actually, you should be sleeping, young lady. You should be in your bed. Are you going to go to bed soon? She's like, yes, ma'am. Okay. So kind of a funny story. Most of us try to raise our children with the understanding that in life, we all have to follow the rules, and we are subject to the same rules, regardless of who you are and what you look like and what your family name is and how you're connected. And we, in the real world, it doesn't probably take long for us to figure out that that isn't quite the situation. That isn't quite the case. So a lot of you yesterday expressed absolutely no surprise at the news that the Minister of Health's wife would not be facing any repercussions for an alleged breach of curfew. Now, the interesting thing about this is, of course, the prosecution has given a ruling and, made no indication of why that ruling was made. They never do. So I think I've explained this to you guys before, just even in terms of my own personal experiences, but the police will get a complaint, which in this case, apparently the police commissioner said that they had several complaints. And, oh, sorry. Oh, gosh, sorry. So they had several complaints about this alleged breach, and they would carry out an investigation. And then they would forward that investigation on to the DPP's office, which is basically the prosecution's office, for further action. So what that means is the prosecution, the DPP's office, Director of Public Prosecution, they're the ones who actually make the official determination and whether or not to charge anyone. And then they send the file back to the police, and then the police will notify you that you're going to be charged, and the process goes from there. So, quite interestingly enough, in this case, they've decided that they will not be laying any charges. Of course, they gave no reason why that is. Um, they're just not going to do it. Most of us are not surprised by that outcome. There can be any number of things that lead them not to charge. I mean, whoever got the file could just say, oh, well, this isn't in the public's best interest for us to pursue this case, which, I mean, if the individual is in breach of curfew, they should be um, they should be having to deal with the exact same consequences that everyone else has. The fine seems to be the way to go for first time offenders. So, that's all that we know, is that the file has come back and they will not pursue anything. Now, there are instances, and I've actually had to deal with this personally myself, where the police will say that they themselves, like the original investigating officer, is not recommending the file even go to the legal department, but someone will override him. So the higher ups will say, oh no, we're going to send this file, and make the DPP's office make a determination. And in a case like myself, I mean, we all know that they have an axe to grind with me at the DPP's office. Some even say at the level of the police. And so it's no surprise that every single file they receive on me certainly leads to charges being laid. And then I have to end up fighting the charges. So, as you all know, I'm in the middle of a trial right now. I can't say anything about my own personal testimony that has not been part of open court as yet. And in fact, we haven't even had a chance to cover what happened last week, Thursday and Friday, when I took the stand, but I'm hoping to get an opportunity to do that today. So one commenter on social media said the police weren't brave or stupid enough, using the exact words of the Minister of Health that he used on Wendy Ledger. The police weren't brave or stupid enough to prosecute her. So another person said, I saw this coming because consequences never go to the people that believe they are above the law. It is sad. One other person says, it's the rich that get the pleasure and the poor that gets the blame. Old English proverb. So yes, very, very interesting indeed. Not a surprise, like I said, for those of us who know the real score here in the Cayman Islands. And it's sad, but it's the reality that we all live with. So there have been a number of protests around the world. As you guys know, this week we've dedicated to the discussion of race relations within not just the US, but today and tomorrow we're going to look at in the context of the Cayman Islands. And that's why I was really excited to have Charles back on the program, and hopefully Dr. Frank can still make it, to talk about racism in the Cayman Islands, because we have what a lot of us want to think isn't racism. And I want to talk about, why that is. Why do we not believe that we have racism here? And there are persons around the world now who have joined the fight with their American counterparts on this topic of just standing with, rights. Yesterday we did an article on the what's his name, on the response of Donald Trump to this whole situation, and in return the response of the rest of the world and how they have been viewing what is happening in America. So people are losing their lives now because of the protests, in some cases innocent people, which is something that you never want to see. Obviously, there's been countless property damage, which is, again, is not something that anyone can support, even if you understand potentially where the anger is coming from. But a lot of these persons out there looting are taking advantage of a situation that is, in their minds, already chaotic. And so, it's that much worse. So everyone around the world has expressed an opinion on the situations that are going on. Um, I mean, it's crazy. There's an Australian journalist who was assaulted by police in Washington. Their Canada, their prime minister he was actually shocked. He was so shocked that he was silent for a good 20 seconds because he didn't know how to respond. And then eventually he responded with, saying how disappointed he was and how Trump in particular was handling the situation. And Trump is handling it with handling the protesters, who by and large are peaceful protesters, with riot gear, tear gassing, and so on. The European Union has also issued a statement. Basically, all these countries, even China, which that's funny and ironic, because China has one of the worst records for human rights violations. But even China has said, "Oh, you guys are always talking about us. Now look at you. Look at what your police and National Guard are doing to your innocent protesters, your innocent citizens, and yet you want to tell us how to handle our affairs." So China wasn't really, somebody mentioned this on Instagram, I think, or Facebook, and they were like, "Oh, the Chinese, they're some of the worst infractors," and they weren't really saying anything about that. They were saying, this is the pot calling the kettle black, essentially. Like, how can you tell us not to squash protesters the way that we do with force, when obviously you believe in doing the same thing? It's just that you've not had the opportunity in recent years to have to deal with protesters. In China, in Hong Kong, they've had it, much more recently. So what Trump has done, just to put everything in context in case you haven't been fully aware, is he has invoked an 1807 law called the Insurrection Act to basically squash the peaceful protesters. And that allows him and gives him the authority to call in the National Guard into cities and states, whether they actually want it or not, because a lot of these mayors have said that they have no interest, like the mayor of New York, for example, has said that they have no interest in Trump trying to resolve the situation or assisting with the National Guard, because they do not see that as being a useful means of doing so, that it needs to be something within their control, that they can deploy their own police. And police do have riot gear and stuff like that. They may not have to use it often, but they do have it available to them. So oftentimes how you de-escalate a fight isn't by bringing in the heavy hitters and bringing in all the bombs and stuff to just drop on people. And there are some concerns that the National Guard is getting instructions from Trump to essentially take anyone out. And what that means is even the peaceful protesters who have a right to protest are getting caught up in this. And there have been several instances of the National Guard tear gassing them. So we saw a couple days ago in Washington, Trump gave instructions to move a crowd of peaceful protesters by tear gassing them, hitting them with the rubber bullets, which apparently are very dangerous. There's a man who, I don't know if he's yet died, if he's still in a coma, but he was hit in the face with a rubber bullet, and he's now in critical condition, and he may lose his life because of that. So just because it's a rubber bullet doesn't mean that it can't be deadly. And so Trump gave those instructions because he actually wanted a photo op in front of a church right across, apparently, from the White House. He wanted to walk over there and have this photo opportunity uninterrupted. And there are people around the world who are seeing this and who are very shocked and surprised by it. So a couple persons have said, like the Washington Post shared that, in terms of him walking over to Lafayette Square so he could pose in front of the historic St. John's Church with the Bible, they gave orders to use tear gas, flash grenades, and rubber bullets to clear a path for the president and his Bible. Chinese media has condemned the hypocrisy of the US, highlighting Beijing's alleged attempts to control or curtail freedoms in Hong Kong, which they are doing. And then essentially they've said, you're doing the same thing with protesters. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says that she was horrified by what we've seen. Australian Prime Minister Maurice Payne is actually reviewing the country's travel advisories for both Washington and Chicago after one of their citizens was attacked by police. And again, he was a cameraman that was assaulted in the face. He was punched and struck in the chest with a police shield, obviously by a police officer. And then it was shared that the sight of officers repeatedly striking a foreign news crew has left many international observers with the sense that this is new, unwelcome territory for the land of the free. So I don't know if it's new or if it's just more recent. So yeah, this was some of the stuff that was covered. Some guy named Rajit Sulu, who's a correspondent with the Middle East Eye News, tweeted, "Congrats, America. You've joined the Middle East nations where you can no longer peacefully protest outside of the presidential palaces." Because in the Middle East, you're definitely probably getting shot for real, not just a rubber bullet. But they're saying, hey, America always wants to talk about peaceful protests and democracy, and your leaders are like, yes, people have the right to protest, but it seems like that's only true for certain people and I guess certain leaders in America. So the Cayman Islands has actually joined in on the discussion. There's a video yesterday that was circulated called "We Demand Justice," which is a compilation video kind of reenacting someone being arrested by the authorities and being subjected to ill treatment. And then there were various persons joining in, Mousy and a few others, about how they feel about seeing what's happening in the US and crying out with our American counterparts for justice. Now, I want to bring this conversation back to the Cayman Islands because I'm always quite shocked and surprised when Caymanians say that we do not have racism here in the Cayman Islands. Because the truth of the matter is, there's actually nothing farther from the truth. Not only do we have racism here in the Cayman Islands, some of it is so incredibly ingrained in who we are as a people that maybe that is why we don't actually recognize it, because it's pretty deep, It's been with us for a long time, and it is a product of our slave history. And so a lot of people don't even think that the Cayman Islands had slaves. Like I hear people saying stuff like, well, we didn't have slavery here, or it wasn't that bad. And I'm thinking, well, as Charles mentioned the other night in the show, what is not that bad slavery mean? You had slavery, the very definition of what slavery is, means that there are people who were brought here not by their choice, obviously, and whether they were domestic slaves or otherwise, they were still slaves. And so they had to do things that it was not voluntary, right? So yes, the Cayman Islands is not a large farming community. So we may not have had a whole lot of slaves that were subjected to large plantations because we didn't actually have any large plantations in the Cayman Islands. But that vision of what slavery is, right? That you have to have been on a large plantation in order to be subjected to slavery is misconstrued. You can be a domestic slave. I mean, you could be a sex slave. We've seen that as one of the things that have emerged, over the years, all over the place. So we definitely had slaves. We had slavery, and the fact that people don't know their own history, I think, is astonishing. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I am not a historical expert, so feel free to join in the conversation and definitely let me have your views. Tamara, good morning. Joan, Sophia, good to see you guys. Morna, thanks for joining in. Sean is here. Barbara says it's a lot of races in the Cayman Islands, here in the Cayman Islands. And, Barbara, maybe that's what gives us some comfort and some misguided belief that we don't have racism. So I'm going to talk about that here in a second. Because we do have a mixture of persons here. We have a mixture of nationalities here, but does that mean that we don't have prejudices against different nationalities? Absolutely not. So here's a little bit of information about the Cayman Islands. So, sorry. The first Cayman land grants by the English crown were made in 1734. And it is likely that these first settlers brought slaves with them. Of course they did. I mean, there were slaves here. They were, we have a count here in a second we're going to talk about. So the holdings were granted to, these are some of the names: Campbell, which of course these are last names that we're familiar with, Middleton, Bodden, Spofford, which I don't know anyone with that last name, but that's interesting, Foster, and Crimble. So some of those names we're still very familiar with. In 1773, the cartographer George Gould drew the first map of Grand Cayman for the Royal Navy. He made a note in the margin marking the population at 400, half free and half slaves. And I'm going to talk about this half and half here in a second. So I see Alric has shared something with us. Alric, give me 1 second. I'm going to just pull that up so that I can grab some information from that as well. By 1802, when Edward Corbett did his census, the population of Grand Cayman had grown to 933, of which 545 were slaves. Interestingly, only 2 of the original families, Foster and Bodden, remained. So that's why I've never heard of we hear of Campbells, but I think a lot of the Campbells that we have now weren't part of this original grouping. They actually came by way of Jamaica sometime afterwards. So yeah, I don't know any Middletons as a big name in the Cayman Islands. I definitely don't know any Spofforts or any Crimbles. So that makes sense that by 1802, only two of the original founding families, Fosters and Bodden, were actually still here. It says that it's possible that some of these families returned to Jamaica with their slaves, having found Cayman unsuitable for planting on a large scale. So this is, again, one of the important things that I think historically has led many persons to believe that slavery did not exist in the Cayman Islands, simply because we did not have large-scale plantations, because the topography and really just the makeup of the Cayman Islands, even our soil is not the best for planting. So I'm always very interested in what people have to say about even modern day farming. And they think that it's so easy to farm in the Cayman Islands. We don't have the best soil in the world. I can tell you that because My husband actually comes from the country in Jamaica. He's from St. Mary, and he comes from, they're farmers. So they actually have a farm, and they have different animals and stuff on their farm. And his father was a beekeeper after he retired from his government job for many, many years. And so he knows a lot about. I'm always surprised that, I know one side of him extremely well, like, being tech savvy and all this kind of stuff. But once he gets out in the garden and he starts digging and getting his hands dirty, I hear him sharing stuff with our daughter about nectar and, just the soil types that are available and different things. So he wants to start a little miniature garden with her. But he's always like, the soil here really isn't the best available soil. And so you have to try to substitute for that where you can. So, we just don't have the most conducive environment for farming. And even in terms of our modern day situation, a lot of people miss out on the fact that there's certain things that don't really work well here in the Cayman Islands. So those early days, I can only imagine, were very, very challenging for persons. And that is why we import such a large portion of our food from day one. So at that time, the early 1800s, we're looking at about no more than 985 slaves out of a total population of about 2,000 when slavery was officially abolished in 1833, resulting in a ratio of about one slave to every one non-slave. So in other words, you had about a 50-50 split. I think it's important to talk about this 50-50 split because that is one of the reasons why even within the Caymanian population, we are so incredibly diverse. So you will find Caymanians almost from every walk of life that have mixed with, what a lot of people here refer to as Cayman whites. I don't personally believe that there's such a thing as a Cayman white. You're either, in terms of races, you're either white or black. If you have any ounce of black in you, then by definition, you're considered of Negro descent and you're considered black. But Caymanians want to make themselves feel better. So we have coined this term Caymanian white people. So, so with half and half, 50% of the population being slaves and 50% being free individuals, you could see where it would be very, very easy, even in the early days, for those two groups to mix because you kind of had no choice, really. I mean, 50% of the population were actually slaves. And so, you would end up being in relationships with them, whether it was voluntary relationships or not. Because, of course, back then, if you were a slave and a non-slave approached you for sex, it's not like you had a choice. This is part of the legacy of slavery. You did not have the option of saying no to someone. As a matter of fact, even if you were not a slave back then, just in terms of women's rights, you didn't have the option of saying no to sex from a spouse or almost anyone, really. I mean, obviously, at some point, it would become rape if someone that you didn't know did it, and even then, there were laws to say if a man took your virginity, and that's a nice way of saying that he raped you. If he offered to marry you, then that was enough to make that rape disappear, and it was no longer considered a criminal offense. And you guys should look that up because that's a very interesting side story of how those things operated to hold women, in a certain position within societies. But there was a woman, I can't remember her name right now, who actually fought. She's one of the landmark cases where she actually fought against this, and she refused an offer of marriage, and she actually wanted her rapist to be held accountable for his actions, because she said it shouldn't be enough that you should be able to rape me, assault me, take my virginity, and then all of that becomes right because you, as the perpetrator, gets to offer me a hand of marriage. And in most cases, the women were forced by their families, so that the families do not get disgraced or insulted, they would then accept this marriage offer on behalf of these young ladies. So then you were forced into a relationship with your rapist, which is unbelievable. But back to the point of slavery. So there would have been a lot of mixing, voluntary and otherwise, of the two groups. And so, we have Caymanians of all colors and shades of the rainbow when it comes to the colors of their skin. We've got Caymanians who, have blue eyes and green eyes, and then very darker complexions and dark hair. And so you can see how, just by looking at our population, kind of how we are relatively diverse and mixed. And one of the interesting things that has come out of that as a result of this mixture isn't necessarily that we're more accepting of each other, because to be honest, that's really not the truth if we want to be very frank about this, but that we have adopted more of a colorism, prejudice than straight out racism. So, what I mean by colorism is depending on where you fall on the spectrum of the how light your skin is, or how kinky or not your hair is, you could be accepted more than your darker counterparts. So, colorism is very closely linked to racism, obviously, but it's discrimination based on like shade. They have a term shadeism as well, right? So it's the skin color. We've got people who, again, are very dark, and then you've got all the way up to what we would consider, white persons. So this colorism is quite interesting, and I want to talk about that in the context of, a few things here. And there's a whole graph of, what colorism may look like, and how people accept that, and not just the Cayman Islands, but all over the world. It's kind of like when you go to the makeup counter, if you are a woman, you will know, of course, that you have to pick a shade of foundation that matches your skin. So they will have a plethora of shades. And in fact, it's got to the point now where women, when you shop for makeup, if it's a really good brand, they will know that sometimes your complexion does not fit within a specific predetermined shade. So you have got to, custom make a shade. So now they have where you can blend. Makeup artists do blending all the time. So here's a photo that gives you an example of what we're talking about when we're talking about colorism. So the woman on the right is obviously a darker complexion. The young lady in the middle is a little bit more what we would call brown, I guess. And then the lady on the left here, which is what would be, by many standards, the desired look, the desired color, if you will. She's still not white, but she's, whiter, if there's such a thing. She has a straighter nose. She still has very curly hair. So her hair is obviously not straight. But for many people, this is the epitome of beauty, and she would be more desirable to them than the woman on the far right, who has natural hair that is, quite a different texture than the lady on the left. So in terms of discussing this, we saw Indira share on Monday. Was it Monday? No, Tuesday, sorry. On Tuesday's program, that she has been subjected to this colorism. She's got a brother, and as with a lot of siblings, sometimes your siblings just come out looking a little bit different than you, and you're for the same mother and dad. I see this all the time. And so she might be sort of the person in her family that looks a little bit fair skin with, a little bit different hair texture, whatever. Although her brother is a little bit more brown than her, but his hair, maybe just because it's shorter, is actually straighter than hers, which is kind of interesting. But these are the things that Caymanians have historically been very, very concerned about: shades of color. And that determines your ability to do a lot in this community, even in modern day Cayman. So, this history here says that, in fact, the Cayman Islands was very different and unusual in that regard to all the other Caribbean islands, in particular Jamaica, as a prime example, they're our closest neighbors, where the ratio of slaves was actually 10 slaves to every one free man at the time of emancipation. So, again, I think when you look at the population of the Cayman Islands, you look at the colorism that exists, the different shades of color and very beautiful people that we have here. Some of that has come out of the result of us mixing from very, very early on, because we had this unusual percentage of 50-50 split to slaves versus free men. So in Jamaica, again, the ratio was 10-1. For every 10 slaves, you had one free person. So the slaves outnumbered, the free men, and of course the slaves would have originated from Africa and of that African descent. So when you have that number, you tend to have more of an opportunity to be able to remain within your culture and remain, within African families and so on. So in exchange for their freedoms, the claims of all 116 Caymanian slave owners received almost £500,000 back then. So let me just make that very clear. The 116 Caymanian slave owners were paid to free the slaves. So that's what emancipation was about. We will pay you. So they got the compensation, not the slaves. So this article says, and this is where again we get interesting, to this day, Cayman has very good race relations. And according to the author Gary Lee Roper, quoting from his book Antebellum Slavery, Grand Cayman differs greatly from its neighbor Jamaica, and that there was no large plantations on the three islands, and slaves were limited to the trades and domestic arts. Domestic arts. You were just a domestic helper. Why do we love to sugarcoat things? This is in part what differentiates the Cayman Islands from other slave-owning nations in this period. Although slavery existed in the Cayman Islands for about a century, it was not ultimately able to prosper because the main sources of industry on the island were not in areas that were conducive to slave trade, such as farming and agriculture. Now, this is where I will, perhaps say something very controversial. I don't know. But in my opinion, that conclusion is the wrong conclusion that we should be drawing. The mere fact that we did not have plantations, large farming, or agriculture does not mean that the legacy of slavery and the ills that come with that do not exist here in the Cayman Islands. But I can see in the minds of people how they would wish to come to that conclusion to try to, in part, make themselves feel better. I don't know. Do we feel better because we think that we didn't have slavery here, and because we didn't have slavery here, we now don't have racism in the Cayman Islands? The reality is we had slaves. Doesn't matter. I mean, I guess in terms of the type of slavery. So let's break this down. If you were a domestic slave, right, you were in close quarters with your slave masters. So you may have had the opportunity to see them a little bit closer one-on-one. Maybe that allowed a certain bond of fondness to build. Maybe the slave master, the husband of the house, would have more access sexually and otherwise to the slaves. And that is how a lot of mixing happened at those early stages. So it's still slavery. It may have led to a certain diversion of what we think of traditional slavery. So if you were on a plantation, you had a plantation of thousands of slaves, yeah, the household, the wife, the even the slave owner, the plantation owner, may not have really come in contact with a lot of those slaves. He may have had a plantation manager that was responsible for keeping, or more than one, I'm sure, for keeping all of those slaves in check. So, on occasion he might take a horse and ride out on the plantation to kind of see what was going on. So the nature of the relationship, I think, would be a little bit different, and that's understandable. Again, giving the uniqueness of how slavery developed here in the Cayman Islands, but it still doesn't mean that we did not have slavery. And what I find that we have happening, and I want to talk about this here in a second, is we have racism that exists in this country, but we're happy to hide under the guise or the auspices of it being what's the word that I'm looking for? Financial, not. I'll soon think of the term. Give me a second here. It's on the tip of my tongue. Classism. Yes. So we are more likely to accept that classism exists because somehow we think that that's better. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about, kind of why that is. So let me have a look at some of your comments. Thank you so much for your contribution. Alric, I do have the document up here now that you have shared. And this document is called, for the benefit of those of you who may be interested, the West Indian, what is this? Philatelist. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And then this is June of 1955. And it has British Caribbean, philatelic community, Jamaican tertiary display. They have things here about Jamaican, and they've got the Cayman Islands as kind of a subcategory, of course. And oh, this is quite interesting. Thank you, Alric, for this. This has a general account of the number of inhabitants on the island of Grand Cayman, distinguishing their color and place of residence, etc. So let's just back up here. This is June the 3rd of 1802, the Corbett Report, Lieutenant Governor Nugget Letters on the Cayman Islands. Thank you for this historical tidbit, Alric. It says, I instructed Edward Corbett to proceed to the Cayman Islands and to give a full account of the island's population, cultivation, soil, etc. This report was written by Corbett on the 21st in Jamaica, which was handed to me the same day. The Grand Cayman is the only one of the 3 islands inhabited. So this was 1802, which is situated nearly 50 leagues to the westward of Jamaica. Steering a course from Negril Bay, west-northwest, it is from 9 to 10 leagues in length from east to west. Its broadest part is eastward, about 7 miles, and its narrowest about being 2 miles. In approaching it from the westward, the first settlement that is met is called Bodden Town. So as we know, Bodden Town is actually the original capital of the Cayman Islands. This town or village, of which there are about 20 white families, chiefly built up by the family whose name it bears, and who I understand to be the oldest and most respectable settlers in the island. So of course we know the Bodden name very well. The entrance to it from the sea is opposed by a reef of rocks, which admits only canoes, and it's extremely dangerous for strangers to attempt to pass in boats of any description. Well, that would have been back then, right? Now we have drug boats coming in that area all the time. Proceeding along to the coast, to the westward, there are settlements of less importance, which are named on the list of inhabitants and their residents. At the western extremity is a capacious bay called Sandy Bay, and the south part of which contains a similar number of white families as Bodden Town. So Sandy Bay would now be West Bay. Georgetown, which was formerly named Hogstyes. This is so good, Alric. Thank you for sharing this. This is like a history lesson that most of us never got. Sorry, let me just pull this back up. So Georgetown, which was formerly called Hogstyes, and of course we know Hogstye Bay, that still remains, has the only harbor in the island into which vessels of any burden could enter. And I'm guessing that's why it later became the capital. It is perfectly secure from every wind except those from the westward. There is a good anchorage for vessels of any burden not approaching nearer the shore than 8 fathoms of water. After a quarter of a mile or less upon the north side of the island is a large sound called the North Sound. Its entrance is found by 2 points, one called Baker's, the other Rum Point. So imagine this, Rum Point all the way back then had that name. A reef of rocks run from each, but in which, however, there are channels admitting vessels not drawing more than 9 feet of water. In the course of the war, which has just terminated, they have not been annoyed from any quarter, but in the war which preceded it, the island was attacked by the Spaniards from Cuba and were totally defeated. And I never knew that. This is amazing history. The island could muster about 80 persons capable of bearing arms. At Georgetown, there's a small fort, and we know where that fort is, not very well constructed, which mounted 4 guns and 4 or 6 6-pounders, by no means well equipped. This place would be most accessible to an enemy, as being the only place where vessels of burden could anchor with security. Upon the road to Bodden Town, which is 15 miles from Georgetown, there's another fort mounting 4 guns and intended to oppose the progress of an enemy landing in Sandy Bay and moving eastward. Where is Sandy Bay? I'm going to have to ask some of our historians if they know exactly where Sandy Bay is, because I was thinking West Bay, but based on this, it sounds like it's somewhere between Georgetown and Bodden Town. We'll find out. Except at Sandy Bay and through the channels of the North Sound, all of the coast of the island is almost inaccessible. The nature of the soil near the shore all around the island, except at Georgetown, is sand and consequently barren and incapable of production. So that's important. This is considered to be the cause of the this is considered to be the case with the interior of the island from the eastward to near the center, which has not been explored, appears to be entirely rock, water, and underwood. So, you know, the Cayman Islands were, I think, really formed because of a volcano eruption. So that's why we have hell, and we have that kind of rocky cliff, and we see that, you know, all over a lot of times the interior of our island. So again, that's not conducive to any kind of farming. And because we are so close to the, you know, the ocean level, you don't dig very far before you hit salt water. So all of these things would have contributed to why large scale plantations and farming did not really take up a foothold here in the Cayman Islands. But let's keep reading this because this is super interesting. It's not a super long letter, so just bear with me. I think this is a history lesson. I'm learning things in here that I certainly did not know. So from Baden Town to Prospect, so 1800s, Prospect had that name. About 7 miles to the westward, the soil is good, although interspersed with rocks, can produce cotton and probably coffee, as there's a small quantity in that corridor doing quite well, also yams and plantains, etc. Except the cultivation of coconut trees along the coast can be found in great profusion. So we do have a lot of coconut trees, but of course, back then, the things that plantations were most interested in cultivating were cotton and coffee, the production of coffee, and cotton being the number one thing, right? So it goes on to say cotton, which the island estimates to make about 30 tons annually, was usually sent to any of the ports on the north side of Jamaica, chiefly Montego Bay, for which they received such supplies as they stand in need of. So who knew, this is the first time that I knew this, that the Cayman Islands had a little bit of an export for the cotton, the small amount of cotton, about 30 tons of cotton that we produced was then sent to Jamaica in order to obtain supplies. So there is this, when it comes to the relationship of Jamaica and Cayman, there is this misconception that Jamaica was taking care of the Cayman Islands as one of its territories, when in fact, looks like if people in the island wanted supplies, they were paying for it with the production of cotton and exporting that to Jamaica. I never knew that we exported anything, to be honest. So there you go. That makes complete sense because back then, listen, even in today's day and age, very few countries who have territories do anything for them for free. There seems to be a greater sense of responsibility and moral obligations on countries who are in the business of colonialism. But in the past, those countries raped and reaped what they could from their colonies and often destroyed a lot of what was there, including the people and the natural resources. And then when they were done with them, they would say, oh, here, take your freedom. You have nothing left of value, but take your freedom and good luck with independence. Turtles, another export that we should not forget, most of us know this, which the island itself furnishes but a small quantity and which is mostly caught upon the coast of Cuba and brought here by small vessels of 20 to 50 tons, and which they have 8 or 9 employed. The turtles are disposed of chiefly to vessels calling on their way to America or Europe. And I don't think Jamaicans are much, in the way of eating turtles, to be honest. So Cayman has more of a turtle history, turtle farming, turtle production, and of course, turtle is supposed to be our national dish, although some people aren't quite sure what our national dish is. We've had that debate before, but most of us will accept that it's turtle. At Georgetown, vessels are supplied with water as well as provisions, which are of good quality and priced about 1/3 less than Jamaica. What? Something used to be cheaper in Cayman? Wow. So vessels are supplied with water as well as provisions, which are of good quality and priced about 1/3 less than Jamaica. It was impossible to ascertain with any degree of precision the quantity of land in cultivation and how much is capable of becoming so. The inhabitants estimate that about 1/3 of the land and no more is adequate to the purpose. And obviously 1/3 is not really a whole lot when it comes to trying to set up the plantation and slave business, right? The nature by which the inhabitants of the Caymans, we get insulted when people say that now, but listen, back in the 1800s, that's what they called us from day one, the Caymans. We're like, no, it's not the Caymans, it's the Cayman Islands. Well, guess what? Actually, it is the Caymans, because that's what they originally called us. The nature by which the inhabitants of the Caymans hold their land is possession. An individual cultivates any spots he finds uncultivated before, and having used it as long as the soil will properly admit of, deserts it either for time or altogether, and clears and cultivates anew. But the land which he may have cleared, although not occupied, is looked upon as his, and it would be considered among themselves as an unfair intrusion to interfere with it. These were the grants. Several of the inhabitants intimated that it would be more gratifying to have their property clearly defined and hold them by a grant from the crown. So at this point in 1802, you did not yet have titles, like official titles of land. And, this is so interesting because we know, for example, many years after that, that there were lots of people who began to sense how the islands were developing and where they could acquire parcels of land in certain areas. And so they would just go and grab a piece of land. Back then, I'm pretty sure that beachfront property was not at the top of their list. That's why we see most of our cemeteries actually being on the beach, because you couldn't plant anything in the sand. It was not really desirous to live that close to the ocean when storms and stuff would come through. So what you did was you put your dead there. You gave them the view of the ocean. How times have changed, right? Now you pay millions of dollars for beachfront property. So let me just get to some of your comments. So Whizbite says colorism is where you have light-skinned Black people and dark-skinned people, but the dark-skinned people get discriminated against by their own Black people. Absolutely. Sean says, Mr. Tony Powell at the Heritage Museum in West Bay showed me original documents several years ago where the bill of sale showed that Black persons were sold for pounds and shillings. Well, of course they were. That's how we know that we have slavery in the Cayman Islands. And this is what I'm telling you. When people say, oh, we have slavery, but it wasn't that bad, I don't even know what that means. You were still somebody else's property, and they could do with you as they wished, which included buying you and selling you and beating you and raping you and whatever. So just because they were not working 18-hour days on a plantation doesn't mean that they weren't working 18-hour days in somebody's house, or 18-hour days, on a smaller farm or turtling or whatever it is that your owner said that you must do. Wiz says Caymanian white, but still have to relax their hair. And of course, there is a very famous politician of the day who it is alleged that he still, to this day, will actually straighten his hair, relax his hair with some kind of relaxer, so that his hair does not look as kinky, because I guess he thinks he's white. But if you're white, you don't have to do those types of things to your hair, like seriously. So yeah, it is interesting that there are people who, as Wiz said, are Caymanian white, but they still have to relax their hair. And you know what? I have seen people, Baudins and all sorts of people, who go out of their way to have their hair straightened, but they don't want anybody to know it, because again, then that calls into question of how white are you really if you have to do that? And so they will get all sorts of treatments done, very expensive, Asian silk treatments and whatever that last a bit longer, that they can afford to give their hair that kind of what we associate with the white population of straight hair. And they will not be seen in certain salons getting it done either, because they're ashamed for people to know that this is what they actually do, which is crazy. I mean, if you want to straighten your hair because that's your thing and that's your look, but by all means, do it. What's the big deal? But because there's like this self-hate and this, I have to perpetrate this misconception that I am white when I'm actually not white. So if anybody knows that I have to do certain things, then that would question my whiteness. Anne was sharing with us yesterday And Anne, I would love to talk to you one day to hear a little bit more about your background. But she was told to pinch the children's noses. I mean, Anne's kids are fairly young. I think they're under 14 for sure. Pinch their noses when they're babies to try to, I guess, straighten it out or make sure that it's a little bit more narrow. What a hot mess. Good morning, Evadne. Sean says the auction of slaves took place in Bordentown, which was the first capital of the Cayman Islands. Good morning, Michelle. Meghan Markle. Okay, we'll maybe get to that here in a second. Alex says the first time I learned about the details of the slave trade was when I went to university in the US. The African, this word always gets me because every time I hear the minister pronouncing it, I'm like, that's not quite the pronunciation. Diaspora, so the African diaspora. We were not taught Cayman history or about the atrocities of slavery in the 1980s and 90s. Racial relations were probably a shock to Caymanians moving into tertiary education in the US. And we will definitely, I think, Alric, between today and tomorrow, talk about some of that as well. Wiz says the epilogue of Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Outliners, talks about how colorism contributed to the successes and hindrances of light and dark people during the days of slavery in Jamaica, and how those effects are still rippling through Jamaican society. And a lot of what he wrote applies to Cayman as well. And it applies to everywhere that there is colorism, which is pretty much all over the world. Cayman history isn't taught in our schools. Sandy Bay is west of Pedro Castle. Thank you for that, Roger. So Sandy Bay, west of Pedro Castle. Okay, that does make a little bit more sense. Michelle says that it's so sad that Cayman history isn't taught in our schools. Many are in denial or better past in the history of slaves here. Wiz says that we used to export cotton, as we saw in that, turtle and thatch rope for supplies from Jamaica. And turtle shell was what was exported to Jamaica. Seymour Ramsey says, teach them, Sandra. Well, I'm learning myself here this morning. So Lashanigans, thank you for tuning in on YouTube. We have the YouTube feed back up, but you guys know YouTube is so panicky. They block you for the most ridiculous stuff. So I don't know how long that will last for, but we do now have on our website. So if for some reason, because YouTube, if we play a video, even in between the show, YouTube goes through and like blocks us for copywriting stuff. And sometimes it's videos and material that is actually in the public domain, like the Star Spangled Banner. Anybody can use that. That's not copyrighted, right? So anyone can use it. Unfortunately, YouTube will still end up blocking you for stuff like that. So I'm not even bothering with YouTube that much. If we get blocked again, just know that you can always go to the website. We stream on Facebook, and you can go to the website directly as well under the heading called live stream, and you can view it from there. So Vlogshins is how you pronounce that, I think. Just in the event, I see you're one of the few people using YouTube today, but in the event that something happens to YouTube in the future, go to the website. So Seymour has a laugh. And then someone says, yes, Logshin says, we know who that is, mega call no names. And we all know who it is. And this is the irony of things here in the Cayman Islands. A lot of times we will say stuff, but we are not permitted to call names because it would be improper for me to make an assertion that, let's just throw out there a hypothetical example, that the premier of the Cayman Islands, Alden McLaughlin, straightens his hair. If I made that sort of an allegation, it's like, oh my gosh, you're going to be open to, and again, this is a hypothetical, you'll be open to a lawsuit. You're going to be open to this. I mean, Caymanians, you got to start just speaking the truth and stop being so afraid. But I get the fear because that's why I'm in court now, facing criminal charges of harassment for speaking the truth on Mr. Matthew Leslie. That's what the truth gets you. And I guess most of you are just not up for being dragged into court. So this is how the system instills fear in us even to this day and keeps us products of mental slavery. Darlene says, some of us Caymanians are in denial for sure. We sure are. Their influence are so strong that even Black people start bleaching their skins and they want to be white. Isn't that amazing? And we mentioned that a little bit yesterday. So let's continue with our history lesson here today because this is super fascinating. Where did I leave off? Right. So about grants by the crown. And so they were families, even in Georgetown, whatever the families were, sometimes they were grabbing pieces of property. A lot of the big landowners in East End and other places, they acquired property just by possession. And that's all that was required back then. You could go and say, hey, I'm taking all this, all 100 acres, all 200 acres. This is for me and my family. Um, Obviously, you were more in a position to do that if you were white and if you were a free person. A slave just couldn't randomly go around claiming parcels of land at that particular stage. Uh, Later on, I think that that would change to some extent. And, you know, Bodden Town being the capital, that's where most persons would have seen desirable at the time. But eventually, Georgetown, became the place to be. And people acquired land by all sorts of shady means later on in our history. So we continue. It was observed that the elder Mr. Bodden, who besides being chief magistrate, is in other respects considered as the first person, was off the island. Considered as the first person. Okay. What does the first person mean in this context? Like the first person in Cayman? I don't know. But it was observed that the elder Mr. Bodden, who besides being chief magistrate, is in other respects considered as the first person, was off the island. The inhabitants preferred delaying any, I think this might be a typo, but it says discussion. Maybe that's actually a word that we could learn today. A new word. Let's look it up. These are the things that we need to know, folks. It's not coming up. So I think it might have been a typo. Maybe it meant to be discussions. Until his return, when they will submit to you, what measures appear to them likely to promote the welfare and prosperity of the settlement? So, slave mentality, one man running the show. In close confinement was one who stands charged with having killed another. Wow, already a murder. Which event took place now about 10 months. The circumstances of the case are told by the inhabitants were, as told by the inhabitants were, the deceased was married to the sister. Can I just hit the pause button? Does this not sound like a Mall Road worthy story? I mean, honestly, this sounds like this is salacious and gossipy and is total Mall Road of the day. Now, let's go back to her story. The deceased was married to the sister of the person now confined. So the deceased was married to, so in other words, his own brother-in-law, now confined, whom upon some domestic quarrel, he heated rather harshly. I love how they wrote back then, with his brother, in some degree insured. This gave rise to an altercation between them and a kind of challenge from the deceased to fight him, who it is said struck the first blow, which the other returned and which proved fatal as he died a few hours later. Wow. That would have been on the Mall Road of the day for sure. You can imagine a murder of your own brother-in-law as a result of basically a fist fight. That must have really hit the Mall Road hard back in those days. I mentioned to Mr. Bodden the younger, the gentleman to whom you gave me a letter, being absent for a short time at the Bay of Honduras. Aha. That you had it in contemplation to accomplish speedily by sending a commission for his trial upon the spot. hit the pause button again. The Bay of Honduras, the Bay Islands, have a very strong family connection to the Cayman Islands. Now, one of these days, we got to find someone in the Bay Islands to really explain this connection between Cayman and Honduras, because I got to tell you, during Hurricane Michelle, when Hurricane Michelle hit, I remember back then I had not too long returned to the Cayman Islands. So this would have been, when was Hurricane Michelle? The late 90s? Hold on. It was one of the most devastating, was it Hurricane Michelle? It was one of the most devastating hurricanes to hit the Bay Islands. 2001. That sounds about right. Yeah, because I came back to Cayman in 1997. So a few years later. This was this hurricane really hit the Mosquito Coast, Nicaragua. It was a humongous Category 4 hurricane. It caused a lot of death and destruction around the Caribbean. And I remember that there were mudslides everywhere. So it killed a bunch of people in Honduras. It impacted us with storm surge and so on. We had $28 million of damage from this, but I think Honduras got hit really, really hard. And so I was sitting down one evening watching the local news, and they were talking about the impact of this in Honduras. And they were interviewing people, in the Bay Islands. And I remembered sitting there, and as soon as these people came on and they started speaking, I was blown away. I was like, hold on. Did they actually say that these people are in Honduras? Because these Bay Islanders sound just like us. And when I tell you that the Caymanian accent is one of the most unique accents in the world, I tell you no lie. I lived in the United States for 15 years. And there were occasions at university, obviously I had acquired an American accent after living there from age 9. And there were times that I'd be walking on campus, and this happened on 2 occasions. I remember once was with a young lady named Cassandra Powell. She later went on to become a Miss Cayman. And I was in my apartment complex at the time, and my dog, was it my dog or her dog? I think it was her dog at the time, I can't remember. But I think her dog had gotten away or something, was under a car, and she was like calling to the dog and, whatever. And I almost got whiplash from hearing her speak, because I turned around immediately and I said, where are you from? Are you from the Cayman Islands? And she's like, how did you know that? Listen, Caymanians have the most discernible, in my opinion, if you're a Caymanian, accent in the world. No matter where you're at and you hear that Caymanian accent, you know that person's a Caymanian. So when I heard these Bay Islanders speak, I did the same thing. Like I did a double take, like, what? Who are these people? Because they sound just like us. I mean, the exact same accent. And I was so shocked during Hurricane Michelle to hear these persons talk. And then that's when it really became obvious to me that there is a humongous connection there between the Cayman Islands and the people of the Bay Islands in Honduras. And, they are very much connected to us. And there's a lot of Caymanian families that would have gone there, settled in the Bay Islands, and never came back to the Cayman Islands. And that is why they have, some of our same last names, like Bauden and whatever else, right in those countries. They learn Spanish as a second language, but they've always said to me, and I had a young lady, a neighbor actually tell me a little bit more about this recently. She's like, we're islanders. We're like Caymanians in the sense that we're islanders. We do not see ourselves as Spaniards. We learn English as our primary language, and we learn Spanish as a secondary language. And so that creates a very unique situation in Honduras, where they have their own division and their own issues because of that. But the point that I'm trying to make here is there's an obvious close connection between the Bay Islands and the Cayman Islands that has existed for a very long time. So it's interesting to see here that they make mention of this Mr. Bodden being absent for a short time at the Bay of Honduras. And again, they're talking about the commission of his trial upon the spot. So let's continue. This is almost finished here. Doubts of his brother or anyone else on the island possessing sufficient knowledge to carry through a business of that nature, and also of the practicability of finding within the island a proper and altogether impartial jury, almost the whole of the settlers being more or less connected by marriage. Well, listen, we also know something called the Cayman disease. And the fact for a long time, we had a lot of incestuous relationships occurring here in the Cayman Islands. So it's no wonder that even back in the early 1800s, because of the small population, they were talking about the issues of everyone pretty much being family and everyone being connected in some form or another. And those family connections, even back then, caused concerns about there being an impartial jury being able to be set up for this man who's now being charged with murdering his own brother-in-law. So that certainly comes as no surprise. And that was why I think a lot of times Caymanians welcomed marital relationships or even just having and building families with persons outside of the Cayman Islands to kind of add a bit of diversity to the population. And, you know, I think we still have one person to this day who is alive with the Caymanian disease, which is a disorder, both mental and physical, not mental, but developmental and physical disorder that, you know, existed because of the fact that we have had so much incestuous relationships in our history. And that's a whole other discussion. So it goes on to say that it was apparent he must be removed to Jamaica. At Bodden Town, there is a small place of worship in which they have divine service. The person who officiated it is not an ordained clergyman, but a respectable inhabitant. When they want to enter into engagement of marriage, they leave for some part on the north side of Jamaica, chiefly Montego Bay. So we did not even have the ability to have marriage, you know, ceremonies and stuff here as yet. The names of these gentlemen now acting as magistrates in the Cayman Islands are attached. They act under a commission from Lord Balcarres, dated on January 1798. There were two other gentlemen associated in this commission, but who are since dead. Those who continue to act are perfectly respectable, but as the residence of all is at, and he actually has a little typo here, he had Buddentown, Budden, it might be a matter of convenience to the inhabitants that some gentlemen residing at Georgetown should be associated with them. The only laws or regulations enforced they consider to be those of Jamaica, as far as they are acquainted with them. So we didn't even have any laws by then. They have no particular police. The magistrates are understood to have the same power as those in Jamaica. When any new measure is to be adopted, it is generally submitted by them to the consideration of the inhabitants at large. That is democracy, folks. An ill-disposed individual may give some trouble, and one of this description was lately shipped off the island to America by the United Voice, by compulsion of the inhabitants. So look at that. Back then, we were shipping our unwanted individuals off, troublemakers, and we're still doing that to some extent today, except now we ship them to the UK. The story is told that the original settlers were pirates, but it is considered that the original settler was a person of the name of Bodden, and who was a soldier in the time of Oliver Cromwell. From him, it is considered the family of that name now residing in the island is descended. The greatest the greatest part of the inhabitants now upon the island have been born there, and the families of color of which your excellency will perceive there, about 20 were represented to me as discreet, orderly, and industrious. Isn't that interesting? And that's the last sentence of this. The families of color, so Black people, of which your excellency will perceive there, about 20 were presented to me as discreet, orderly, and industrious. And back then, you had better be as a person of color. And then they have a breakdown here of the inhabitants. East End, number of white families, 1 family, it says 3, no slaves, according to them. People of color, number of families, 2. And then it says family, 7, and slaves, 1. Okay. Okay. I'm not sure that makes a whole lot of sense, but at Frank Sound, they had 1 white family, and it says white. Let me see if I can screen grab this, because maybe you guys can help me figure this out a little bit more. So we have let me just see here. Yes, I want you guys to help me figure this out. And again, all of this helps put in context the subsequent discussion that we will have between today and tomorrow about how we've gotten where we are. We have to understand and we have to know our history, right? So help me figure this out, guys. Here we go. Let me just pull up this image. Help me figure out these numbers here and how to read this bit of information. Okay, so we have Frank Sound, East End, Bordentown, Little Pedro, I guess that's what it was called back then, Spots, Prospect, Southwest Sound, which I guess now is South Sound, Georgetown, formerly called Hogstyes, West Bay, Boatswain's Bay, North Side. So that's the overall inhabitants, and I guess they have it then broken down further from there. So we have number of white families. North Side had 1, Boatswain Bay had 8, West Bay had 8, Georgetown had 17. And then the next column says family. So I don't know, is that, I don't know how that number becomes 309. Not quite sure. And then we have slaves, people of color, and the number of those families. And then it has another one called family, and then slaves. So Hogseye had, which is Georgetown, had 17 slaves, and then 2 free, it said. So what looks like West Bay, Little Pedro had 16 slaves, Spots had 16. A list of the inhabitants of the island distinguishing their place of residence, number in each family, and slaves they possess. So I guess the first column is the number of families, and then the second column must be how many individual persons were in each family. So at East End, you had 1 white family and 3 people in the family. This probably makes more sense. Frank Sound, you had 1 white family, 5 people in the family with 1 slave. Bordentown, which obviously was the capital, so of course numbers here are large. They had 24 white families, 104 persons in that family, and 233 slaves. They had a lot of slaves in Bordentown. White families, they have the names John Thomas, And then the people of color were Charles McLean. So already we see that McLean name. Charles Pouchet. Does that then become Poochie? Because I know we have some Poochies in Cayman. And you know, a lot of Caymanans changed the spelling of their names as time went on. At North Side, we had a Stephen Bodden. The people of color was M. Thatcher Sr. and Jr. So, interesting. At Town, I'm going to screen grab Town, and then we can look at West Bay. This has become a little bit more of a history lesson this morning than anything else, but I do think that, again, this is necessary because it puts in context what some of us may not know about the history of these islands and how we very much had slaves here. And then we can certainly, continue the conversation from there to really come to understand how it is what it is. So here we go, Town. So we have James Bodden, Esquire, Joseph and William Connor. Now look at how this spelling, Connor, is almost how you'd say that. And I'm pretty sure that that would become Connor later on. So you see how amazing names can be changed and how names are. We have a Benjamin, and I don't know what this other first name would have been, E-E-N-J, what that's shortened for. McCoy, so there's a junior and senior. Looks like that's a typo, because if it's a junior and senior, it should be the same name. So that's probably another Benjamin, but they accidentally typed E instead of B. So the McCoys were here from then. Charles Seaman, haven't seen that last name. James Connor, again, very close to Connor. William McCoy, William Bodden, Fattern, James Fattern. I wonder what that, never heard that name before. There's a Leach, James Wood. So of course we know there are lots of woods here in Cayman. Silver, and look, John Watler. You know, speaking of the Watlers, Oliver Watler and Miss Kathy Fraser, one day we're going to bring them on the show because they know a lot about Cayman genealogy and history. And in fact, Oliver has traced his Watler, Oliver Watler from East End, they have traced their family tree back to the original Watler settlers, who we understand were actually two brothers from Jamaica that came by way of Jamaica. I think they were from England that came by way of Jamaica. So in other words, they probably went to Jamaica for a time, settled there. They were slave plantation owners, and then eventually moved on to the Cayman Islands and decided to take settlement here. So there has been this contention, and this goes back to, and this is why history is so important. This goes back to race. So as you guys know, there's several family trees here in the Cayman Islands, and there are Watlers who are black Watlers, Watlers of color. And then there are the Watlers who consider themselves white. And again, in my opinion, I want to make it very clear, there's no such thing as a white Caymanan, but that's my opinion. So those persons have always in their minds been very different and apart from the black Watlers. And they, a lot of them even to this day will tell you, no, they're not family, they're not related. They come from very different areas. But as it turns out, Oliver Watler has traced his family tree, and he has discovered that the truth of the matter is all of the Watlers in the Cayman Islands come from those two singular brothers who migrated here by way of Jamaica. So whether you're a black Watler or you're a white Watler, you are all related and come from the same two original brothers who were settlers on this island. So there's no difference between them from a familial perspective. So that has been a creation or a figment of people's imagination. And this is where sometimes people try their best to rewrite history to somehow, make people believe that they're white and then the other Wattlers came from, I don't know where they thought they came from, and they're Black and they're not connected to the white Wattlers. You came from two brothers. So you're all connected, you're all family. West Bay, we have John Bodden. That was a family of 6 that had 2 slaves. We have Thos Hyde. Now look at the spelling of that name, Hyde, Hide. Now we know that no Hydes in Cayman spell their name that way. They spell it Hyde. So that was probably either a typo, because of course back then, they didn't always get it right. That was either a typo, or at some point they changed the spelling of their name from Hide to Hyde. Rivers, we know the last name Rivers very well from West Bay. Walker, again, Isabella Hoye, Hoye. And again, I sort of think, I wonder if that's not, I've never seen that name, so I don't know much about that. We have an Edwin Hall and a Mary Jeanette. So some of these names really stand out. Of course, the Ebankses, Boatswain's Bay, they're all over that. And they had a bunch of free Negroes in Boatswain's Bay, which is super interesting. Henry Ebanks, Augustus Ebanks, Barnett Ebanks, Mary Mitchell, Thomas Bishop, Amazon. Who's Amazon? That's only one name. But the Ebankses, of course, one of the earlier settlers, their name shows up there. We have William Collins. We have Bush, Margaret Bush, James Bush. Again, they had slaves. Higgins, another Bush, Hind. I can barely see this one. Let me just pull it up on another screen here. That one says Tulinary. I don't know who that is. I've never heard that name before. Watler, of course, Wade Watler. That looks like a typo of just 2 T's instead of 1. There was a John Bodden. This is now South Sound area. John Conur again. There's a Fattern, Marianne. There's a lot of Fatterns back then. I kind of wonder what happened to that family. There's a Dorothy Spleen, and the list goes on. We see the McLeans, Diana McLean at Frank Sound, Absalom Bodden at Frank Sound. There's a Sutherland, and Thomas Sutherland was one of the white families in Frank Sound. Wade Watler Jr., Thomas Thompson, William Eden at Spots. Of course, the famous William Eden would ring bells if you're familiar with the history at Pedro Castle. We see the name at Spots of Smith Coe. We know the last name Coe. There's a William Bodden, William Watler, Knowles Eden. So we're very familiar again with the Eden last name, but even the Knowles. John Drayton, Abraham Bodden, Sterling Rivers, Sarah Nixon. So look at that. The Nixons are here already at this point. William Jeanette, George Bodden, W.S. Prescott. This is Georgetown. Cornelia Scott, Mary Wilson, John S. Jackson. So what you have is some names, because it says free Negroes, William Trusty, and then it has the people of color. So at some point, they may get named, I think, if they were free Negroes. So C. Parsons, James Parsons, William Parsons, Lind Rivers, George Barrow, William Trusty, Catherine Mitchell. Those persons are actually named, I believe, because they were free. And you probably, if you were not a free slave, did not even get the privilege, if you will, of being named. So that's fascinating. And then they have some information here about officers of the militia. So again, most of those would have been Captain Bauden, James Bauden, William Bauden. Georgetown, you had a John Jackson, Rivers, Captain and Lieutenant Collins, and James Coe was for prospect spots and so on. Alric, I want to thank you so much for sharing this document. This is so interesting. First flight covers, they talked about some of the first flights into the island: Jamaica, Miami, Trinidad to Jamaica, Kingston to London. So that's quite a bit of interesting history. And again, the bottom line is we obviously were a country that had slaves, 50-50. That's a high percentage of slaves versus non-slaves. And so, Catherine, thank you so much. Catherine says lots of slaves were given the master's surname, which is true. Halls are from Jamaica. Oh, Karen says that it may have been Hurricane Mitch in 1999. Ah, Karen, I think you're right. Because I thought Michelle, I remember Hurricane Michelle, but I'm thinking that seems like it was too, yes, yes. Karen, thank you so much. It was Hurricane Mitch because it was the second deadliest Atlantic hurricane on record at that time. And it was devastating to Honduras, including approximately 7,000 persons having died in Honduras, 3,800 in Nicaragua. Because when I was reading the description for Hurricane Michelle, I'm thinking, this doesn't sound that bad. Like the storm that I'm thinking of in my head was devastating. And that's why they went to the Bay Islands to interview people there to see how they had fared the storm and how they were doing. So, Karen, thank you, my dear. You were absolutely right. Hurricane Mitch. There are lots of Honduran Caymanians from the Bay Islands that can give you the history. I would love to talk to some of them. Ramsey Seymour also said, yes, it was Hurricane Mitch. Marjorie says, with what is happening in and around the world, you thought it would change some persons, but it brings out the worst. Sad, but true. Most Caymanians don't consider themselves Black, and that's the discussion. That's why I wanted to dig into the history a little bit to show that you would have to be Black. And in fact, it would almost be near impossible for any one of the original settlers, the Baudens, for example, or the Fosters who remained, to still be pure. Like, let's say they came from Europe and they were originally white, right? With 50% of the population being slaves and 50% being free, you could see how easy, even if it was voluntary, you could see how incredibly easy it would be for people to start mixing immediately and families to either officially intermarry, non-officially intermarry, just have children, have relationships with people. And so the population would have become mixed very, very quickly from one generation to the next. Seymour Jason says, all slaves spelled the same, doesn't matter what category you fall in. Jamaican Cayman would be living, should be living more loving. Good morning. So Anne says, no matter how light-skinned you think you are, they consider you as Black in the States. And I mean, let's just be honest. I think the test is if you have 1 ounce, 1% of Black blood, you're considered Black. And, you know, now we have people saying, okay, they're mixed race, mixed whatever, but on a census, you have to tick off that box that says that you're Black. Jackie says, yes, my grandmother then used to sell coconut to Honduras and used to go in a canoe there. And one of the trips, they stayed in Honduras and never came back to Cayman. So it's all true. She taught us a lot about Cayman. There you go. So Caymanians migrated to different places, including the Bay Islands. South Marjorie says, I've lived other places around the world, and honestly, I've never met more racist people like in Cayman. Literally seen and hear it over and over again, not only by Caymanians, but by others. Really disheartening. Wiz says, I know someone from Cayman who was what you would call Cayman white, which again, I don't believe in that term, but okay. And she didn't talk to anyone who was darker than her. She met one blonde haired, blue eyed guy from Georgia. He took her to meet his mother. When she came back to Cayman without the man, she spoke to everyone then. So I'm assuming what Wiz is trying to say is she got a reality check of Georgia being the South, of what they considered white. And although she considered herself Cayman white, they did not consider her Cayman white. So maybe that experience helped to open her eyes as to the realities of racism around the world. And that she needed to maybe adjust her attitude and stop being racist herself. Sandy, did you know that a lot of mangroves areas, North South Sound, were once owned by the Seymours, all the way to CUC? Can you imagine where Ritz-Carlton, Crystal Harbor, Governor's Harbor, Canal Point, etc., considered rich areas were once owned by the poor Black Caymanians? Yes, Sean, I can imagine that. And unfortunately, the poor Black Caymanians couldn't see into the future, and they didn't see the value of land ownership. And a lot of them practically gave away their land for little or nothing. And so I'm not surprised by that. And Wiz says the same thing. Unfortunately, many Caymanians without vision sold out their land, and we're now seeing some of the ramifications of that. And we're seeing Caymanians continue to sell out their land, although they should know better. Lewis is saying that you should get Mr. McField to talk about their history. He's the best. I will certainly invite him on the program. Catherine says, want to know the Cayman history, get the book. He is founded upon the seas from the museum. So Wiz says a lot of times the slaves took the last name of their masters when they were emancipated. So surnames don't necessarily indicate white ancestry. Okay. Yeah. Catherine says that she recently did a DNA test, which is fascinating. I think one day I want to do that. And I am 16.2% West African. Somewhere along the line, we all have some touch of color. And you know, considering that it looks like the human race actually began in Africa thousands of years ago, it would make sense that at some point we all came from African ancestry. So in our minds, when people sit down talking about their white and they have this construct in their head of what white represents, there will be people who argue with you that that just doesn't exist. So listen, we have a few minutes left. Tomorrow morning, we did not have, I don't know what happened to Dr. Frank this morning. He did not come on the program. Charles, unfortunately, wasn't able to make it, but perhaps he can come on tomorrow. We will reach out to some of our historical influencers, including Mr. McField. But you know, when we talk about racism in the Cayman Islands, it does exist. Even Cayman Brac, for example. Everybody knows Cayman Brac has a little touch of something extra when it comes to racism. So they are very staunch in their belief that they are white people, a lot of them. And they do not like Black people. And I have heard of some stories coming out of Cayman Brac in very recent times where you will go to the home of a Bracker and ask for a glass of water. And they may give you the glass of water, but they're going to throw the glass out if you are a Black person after you've left. Or they may just outright refuse to give you a drink of water. And so they are very much still entrenched and concerned with color. Part of the reason why I think that is for the Brac is because a lot of them, how do I say this without trying to insult people from the Brac? It's really because they're not as diverse. So they've not had as many influences. Obviously, Grand Cayman, we have a much larger population here. We have people coming from all over the world and integrated. So it has flushed out the clear distinctions and color in some instances, but we still very much have racism here, which, like I said, we'll continue to discuss. But at the same time, the Black hasn't had that intermingling. So they kind of see themselves as very separate and apart from the Cayman Islands in so many respects. And so I think that having said that, they hold on to a lot of prejudices a lot more than others who have had the exposure. Part of the ways in which, one of the reasons why we're having this discussion is part of the ways in which we become not prejudiced. And I want to be clear, we all have prejudices of some sort. It's a learned behavior, I think, to a large extent, but we acquire it from our parents, from schools, from those around us, from the society at large. And so, we may not have a prejudice against white people, but we may have a prejudice against Jamaican people or people from the Philippines, certain nationalities. And so people as human beings have to work constantly to fight and resist the almost innate desire to become prejudiced. And the way in which we do that, one of the ways in which we do that, in my opinion, is through exposure. The more people that you expose yourself to from all walks of life, the more likely you are to be able to overcome being prejudiced. So hang out with different people. It's called diversity, right? Don't just hang out with Caymanians. If you're English, don't just hang out with English people, because you will see Caymanians and make assumptions about them and think you know certain things about them when you do not. You know nothing of them. And you're going off of what other English people have told you is this very narrow narrative of who Caymanians are. I mean, Caymanians in and of themselves are a very diverse group of persons. We come from all walks of life. I know some of the most intelligent people are Caymanians, just like some of the most ignorant people can be Caymanians. So getting to know people on a personal level and interacting with them allows you to tear down the barriers of racism, classism, and whatever other prejudices that you may have. So yesterday when I was speaking to someone, this person said to me, I said, hey, is there anyone in Cayman Brac who wants to talk about the racism that exists there? And this person actually said to me, in Cayman Brac, we do not have racism. I was like, what? Listen to this. They said, personally, no. I've never really had the issue here, being Black and Caymanian white background. Again, for Caymanians to even call themselves Caymanian white, there's no such thing as Caymanian white. So let us remove that terminology from our vocabulary. But they go on to say, hard for me to say that. I think your issue is more social standing, financial, and education related. So I sent them a voice note and said, listen, the truth of the matter is Caymanians use classism and financial well-being to, as though that's somehow better than racism, to say, oh, we will separate you based on how much money you have as opposed to the color of your skin. Because that's what we're all about here in the Cayman Islands, the coins in your bank account. So that becomes more significant than the color of your skin. I said, the truth of the matter is, however, we use that as a thinly veiled cover to hide our racism. Think about what I'm saying to you folks. The people with the opportunities tend to be the white Caymanians. They are the merchant class, again, because of who they were. So they came in, the Bodens, the Fosters, the Kirkernels, the McTaggarts, whoever, right? Think of all the white Caymanian names that you can think of. They are the people who are the merchant class of this country. simply because they were the slave owners. They were the people who came here with the money. So from one generation to the next, they're able to establish and build businesses amongst that class of persons. And we say, oh, well, then it's classism, it's not racism. But they would have never had that financial standing in life. They would have never been free from the 1800s, 1700s, and 1600s from the onset if they were not white. So our desire to call it classism is a thinly veiled excuse for which we cover up racism, because classism falls along racial lines for 99.9% of the people. So after I said this, the person then says, you have a point. Well stated. It's a lot to be considered. And here's a little known fact in the BRAC. A lot of the Tibbets, Tibbets, Kirkernels, Fosters, all of those persons, Rich, which would be from Northeast Bay in the Creek, the Waltons, again, they all came from this sort of free society versus the slaves, which were the Black persons. And there may have been some intermingling, but by and large, what we want to define as classism is a nice way of saying that we are still racist. So if you're happy to say that you're a classist individual and that you can accept someone if they've got enough money, consider that the opportunities presented to people would have been presented to them based on who they were. So the ability to get an education. Black people in this country did not and were not entitled to free education until not that long ago, which was like the 1960s. We started to see some of these persons being able to go away and be educated in a formal sense. So it is no wonder that, some of the top positions in this country will be held by lighter skinned white Caymanians or lighter skinned individuals, and not really the Black people that we know and, we see amongst us. So classism isn't necessarily any better, but I think at the end of the day, it's a nice way of saying that we are racist. And on top of that, and this is where I want to pick up the discussion tomorrow, is not only are we racist internally amongst ourselves, and we're very much into being colorists, but we have imported people who are racist, and we allow them to treat the Caymanian people, by and large, the Black Caymanian people, as second-class citizens and pieces of shit. I'll read a few of your comments, and we're going to wrap up the show. Wiz says Caymanians is in the past, moved to places like the Bay Islands, Mosquito Coast, Corn Island, San Andreas, Isle of Pines, which is Cuba, for better opportunities. So when you hear some of them speak, you can tell they have links to Cayman. So Louis said yes. Okay, got that one already. Yes. Okay. Catherine says, beg to differ on that comment, Sandy. I'm not sure what comment that would have been, but my family tree shows many people coming from Honduras and Jamaica in the 16, 17, and 1800s. And I would believe that as well. I think we had a back and forth for a minute there between the two. And East End people are very racist, says Olive. I think if we accept that as a people, as Caymanians, there are those of us who have racist tendencies and who are very racist, we can hope to get to the point where we will have a true and honest discussion on racism in the Cayman Islands. And then we go from there. The opportunities that are presented. Even look at the Legislative Assembly. The people that we elect time and time again tend to be very few Black people. And I must say that Makiba Bush is probably, one of the earliest Black persons that we have elected in these islands that, we would consider to be Black. I mean, he's been at it now for a minute. We do have some others who are obviously in there now. I don't know how the premier defines himself personally. I think a lot of people believe that he defines himself as a white man, but even Makiva Bush is a fairer skinned black person, just like Alvin is a fairer skinned black person as well. But like I said, I'm not really sure how he identifies himself, if he thinks of himself as a Cayman white or not. And of course, the thing in the Cayman Islands is, Cayman whites historically wanted to marry other Caymanian whites to preserve that colorism that we were talking about. So it is unusual for a black man or a black woman to be elected to the Legislative Assembly. And we can look at the pictures of who's in there now, and you get a real sense of exactly what I'm talking about. And this is the honest discussions that we need to have. Catherine says, yep, ask my mother about the story. She's an old bracker. Catherine, let me know she's interested in coming and talking to us. We'd love to hear it from their perspective because, they know what was going on. Giselle says, in the BRAC, they sweep the sand in their yard when black people leave. Yep, literally trying to sweep it away as though the black person has put some germs or something on their white sand. Wiz says, in the BRAC, I've heard that they don't drink milk from black cows. But isn't it funny when you speak to BRACer, they're like, oh, well, I don't know anything about us being prejudiced. It's like, really? Well, you must be very privileged then. Catherine says, true, Sandy, I live in East End and was told that if I did not have Caymanian roots, they would never have sold me the house that I now live in. Listen to that. Seymour Ramsey Olive says, yes, I've gone through it, but it didn't make it worry me. So in other words, Olive has experienced some of this. Everyone has prejudices. We have to constantly fight that. Absolutely. And that's what we are here about. That's why constant dialogue is important. Why do we feel the way that we do? How has this been ingrained in our psyche? Why do Caymanians not really, a lot of Caymanians do not like Jamaicans and vice versa? Those are real conversations that we need to have. No one wants to have the Caymanian and Jamaican conversation because people get so emotive and so heated. And I think Jamaicans jump in on the conversation, not always knowing the historical context of things, I guess, just like Caymanians do as well. And then it starts to go far left, far right, all over the place. And so there's a great difficulty in trying to contain that conversation. That's probably why no one has really ever had it. Sean says, ever heard the saying, don't eat eggs from black chickens and don't eat beef from black cows? I have never heard that saying, but I do not doubt that that existed, and probably brackers were at the top of the list of the ones who were saying it. Hey, Jake, good morning. Olive says, I know a woman in Northward. She say that she don't want a car because the tires are black. Her house is all white, yard, everything white. What a hot mess. What a hot mess. I mean, the ignorance is so disgusting. Ramsey says, oh my God, Sandra, I love your show. Empty Thought says, I've seen it since primary school, all the kids, all the way up to Clifton amongst the younger Caymanians. And Olive says, it's true. Once I was looking for a place to rent and heard about this house. When I spoke to the owner of the house, who's off island, she said to me, that lady who looked me in the eye and say, sorry, ma'am, but you're too black to rent this place. I just say thank you and walk away. And yesterday we heard King, who now lives in the UK, talk about his own experiences of when he realized, I guess for the first time in his life, poor King, that we do have racist people here in the Cayman Islands. And this is his experience was with a lady named Lana Hargrave, I believe is her name. She owns Tuca and a few other restaurants, Taka Cantino there in West and East End. And he had an experience with her that his friends had to point out to him, you just realize that this woman discriminated against you, right? Based on how you look. And probably the most obvious thing is because you're black and you're Caymanian. And she refused to rent from him. And I think that it makes me angry and it disgusts me that we are importing prejudiced people And let me tell you, I've heard some stories straight from allegations that the head of the DPP, who's an English man, that he's extremely racist and prejudiced. And that's why Caymanians in that organization will only ever get so far. They don't try to hire Caymanians if they can help it. Um, from even the woman who's handling my case right now, there are comments about her. She's from Saskatchewan. And I hate to say it, but there are a lot of people in Canada who, outside of the sort of larger metropolitan areas like Toronto, they're from some whole dunk town in Saskatchewan that you've never heard of before. And they are extremely prejudiced people. And we bring them to the Cayman Islands. We give them a nice, cushy job, making the best salaries of their lives. And then they're in charge of prosecuting our people, quite literally and figuratively. There's something wrong. There's definitely something wrong with this, folks. And I think that we need to wake up. We allow these persons to become business owners, and then they have the power, the economic power, to hire people. They're not going to hire Caymanians. They're not going to hire Black people if they can help it. These are the realities of what we are talking about when we talk about racism. So we don't have people rioting in the streets. We don't have people losing their lives right now because Caymanians just are not that bold, right? However, that does not mean that we do not have racism, not just at our doorsteps, but in our homes, that we need to be addressing and we need to be contending with. We should not be, and I don't know, how you go about this, but we should not be inviting people into this country and giving them status, giving them citizenship, giving them all the benefits of having to, live very comfortably in the Cayman Islands when they are of the business of perpetrating their racist mentality. And in my opinion, if that means calling them out publicly for who they are and how they think, and the experiences that we have to be able to demonstrate and to show that they are racist, I mean, if Lana has an explanation for why she turned this young man down after she saw him, by all means explain it to us. Because there are other people messaging me about some of your comments on social media that they're like, why are you here? If you honestly feel this way about the Cayman Islands and about our society, why are you here? And I'm not trying to now make this a side conversation about expats versus Caymanians. But the truth of the matter is, there are a lot of persons that come into the Cayman Islands who do not integrate well and do not have our best interests at heart. And they do not care anything about Caymanians or the Cayman Islands. They're just here to further their own financial well-being, their own story. They want to live on a beach, they want to live in paradise, whatever. And they have no real construct of how to do that by integrating into a Caribbean community. Folks, we're out of time. Today is Thursday, so we will have an evening show this evening. If we don't have a guest on, and I'm going to work on a few guests because I do want to bring some other people into this conversation. So I will work on a few guests and see who is willing to join us. But if we don't have a guest this evening, I had said, this entire week would be dedicated to this conversation of race. We do have tomorrow's show, which is another 2 hours again, to certainly have the conversation. This evening, we may review some of the changes that are coming. So maybe we'll do an Ask Sandy segment this evening, because there's quite a bit of changes coming into the stay-at-home provisions, which we've not had an opportunity to on this show because of the trial and just being super busy. We've not yet had the opportunity to get to that part of the discussion. So I want you guys to be fully cognizant of what changes are coming and what's going to happen. So Ramsey Seymour says, two brothers, Charles and Robert Judy, both are extremely racist in the Cayman Islands. Ramsey, we'd love to hear why you think that. What have been your experiences? We need to have these discussions, quite frankly. All right, Wiz, thank you. Great show as always. Appreciate the love, folks. Tune back in 7 p.m. this evening, and then we'll be back at 7:15 in the morning. Debbie, are you just tuning in, young lady? You missed it. Go back and watch it. That's the beauty about having it on Facebook and even on the website and YouTube. It stays on the website until we book the next show, which we'll book a bit later on today for the evening segment. Just a reminder, no press conference today. This week it was only Tuesday and Friday. So tomorrow will be the second press conference of the week. And we continue to get some positive results coming in. We've had a child this week, a 9-year-old child that tested positive. And of course, it's always challenging when you have a child that tests positive because they are at risk. Despite initially we were thinking that they had some sort of protective immunity, when they get it now, they're getting some unusual associated illnesses, a Kawasaki disease, and basically toxic shock syndrome and stuff as well. So thankfully, no further deaths other than the one initial person. And Jamaica is now up to 10 dead. They had another person die yesterday from COVID-19 complications. And so we keep those persons in our thoughts and prayers. Folks, I appreciate the love. Alan Foster says, good morning. The Farnan shown on the list is a typo. It should be Tatum. That would make more sense. Thank you, Alan, for that. We're gonna invite Olivia and Miss Kathy in the program because they definitely have a lot of genealogical information that they can share with us. All right, folks, that's it for me. Time to get to work. Debbie says, sorry, she's been working. I understand. Have a beautiful day, and we'll see you this evening at 7 o'clock.